multitasking is just the world that we live in, and it's for everyone. I mean, that's what's going on, but it's not always beneficial. And I've noticed that my children are doing that. Well, they'll watch a program on television as they're playing a game on their phone. And I'm looking at this going, I'm the worst parent in the world. How do we help this to be a counter catechesis, if you will, to our everyday, very short attention span world, especially younger people?
Well, the research is pretty clear. Except for a very few, you really can't multitask. There's a group, maybe 2 to 3%, called super taskers, that actually they have a cognitive ability to do two things at once that require attention. Multitasking it's the term when people think, well, I can do two things at once. The reality is you can only do one thing at once that requires your attention. Now, we can do two things at once if we have some of those habits built into what's called our basal ganglia, our habit center, like driving. You can be driving and be a safe driver and talk to the person in the seat next to you. You can be driving and listen to the radio, listen to a podcast. So that's not multitasking. But multitasking is a misnomer that God did not create us to give our attention to two things at once. It's one thing. Now, when we multitasking in the common vernacular is really switching from one task to another, maybe very quickly. But there's something called attention residue. When you switch from one thing to the next, that thing that you're working on now, you aren't giving full attention to it because you have to get rid of the residue of this thing that you were thinking about. And then when you finish this, like you think, okay, where was I? And so actually trying to multitask is a very inefficient way to accomplish things. Now, the research will, I'm sure there's some research out there about how this is affecting our kids. Is it long-term detrimental to them? Is it just part of their growing up? Because I know when I was growing up, I didn't have, you had TV, maybe you had the radio, but not the other devices. So I'm sure there's some research that I'm not real familiar with about how this is affecting things. But the reality is attention spans are dropping, attention spans are decreasing, and probably a lot of the technology is part of it.
How do we, I don't want to say how do we still our brains. You talk about that. Actually, you give this illustration in the book where you talk about how holy noticing helps us to, in some ways, untangle our thoughts more clearly. And you gave the illustration about a glass of muddy water, which I could see that as you were saying it. And I went, okay, we see in pictures, we see in stories. Describe what that is for a moment.
Yeah. Well, you think of water, glass of water, you put, a spoonful of dirt and stir it up, it's cloudy. But if you just set that glass down over time, what's going to happen is the sediment will fall to the bottom and there'll be the clear water there. And just learning to be still before God, to be still with your thoughts in nature, in your office, what it does, it actually can bring us to a greater sense of presence with God, and where we can hear his voice. Now, I'm not saying God always speaks in an audible voice. He can, but usually just impresses our heart, or he speaks to us through scripture. By being still, by being quiet, that does allow our thoughts to quiet so that we're more present to him and the thoughts that he wants to plant into our minds, which is obviously what every believer wants. We want to think, we have the mind of Christ, which means we have the potential to think these kind of thoughts. We want to think those thoughts more often than not.